Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 89, Freedom. It felt good to be back on Patch again. As much as Yang had grown to love Vale, there was still something about the city that felt cold. It didn't matter how sunny the sky was, or how bustling the streets were, or how comfortable some places within it could be, that lifeless chill was always there. But on Patch, everything felt alive and warm. Every street, every house, every garden, every stretch of woodland, and all the rolling green hills. There was not a single place she could go on the island where she didn't feel the urge to pull out a notebook and draw the landscape. She could still remember the last time she'd done it, just how much fun it had been to spend the entire day sitting atop the island's highest hill to draw the town. It had probably been her favorite piece that she'd worked on, and the people had loved it so much that they'd hung it in the town hall. Thankfully, the island hadn't changed since the day she left. The bird songs, the rustling trees, the sound of rushing water, the smell of more flowers than even Weiss could possibly name, everything about it was still perfect. Even the large boulder against her back somehow felt softer than the couch back at the apartment, though Yang knew that was likely because she had spent the last 2 hours walking. "I miss being out here," she breathed, groaning in relief as she lowered her feet into the warm river. "So do I," she heard her dad say, the dry grass crunching beneath his feet as he approached. "I wish I could come out here more." The man sat down beside her and shrugged off his large backpack. He looked better than he had over the last few months. He'd finally shaved his beard, the long scraggly hairs trimmed back down to his usual soul patch and jawline stubble. His hair had also been pulled back into a ponytail, causing the man to look much younger than he was. He almost looked like he was going to pull out his old skateboard and start doing tricks, though she knew if he did, then she would most likely have to take him to the hospital. Again. "What are you chuckling at?" He grinned, the small action only making him look younger. "Just remembering something." She shook her head, the smile remaining on her face. "You want to hand me that?" She snapped her fingers towards the backpack. "Here." He lifted it over, and she began to pull out the portable fire pit and pans. "So how's the job hunt going?" "Haven't really had much time to look. You know, with everything going on and all. Thanks for pushing this back, by the way." "It's fine," Ty said with a shake of his head. "It sounds like you've had a rough few weeks." It had been 2 weeks since Willow had come out against Jock, and in those 2 weeks the apartment had become rather full. Not only had Willow and Whitley moved in, but so had Weiss butler Klein. And while she definitely liked the man, he was everywhere. Almost everywhere she went, the man would randomly pop up and ask her if she needed anything, and though she knew he was just doing his job and practically part of Weiss' family, it was definitely taking some getting used to. Unfortunately, Weiss had also become very scarce, having thrown herself headfirst into the business with Fletch, and Yang herself had become so inundated with coursework as the end-of-year exams finally started to loom on her. Adding on to that, Jacques had also begun court proceedings to get Whitley back, which had only caused the boy to retreat more away from his family. Thankfully, though, Willow was remaining true to her word, and was doing everything she could to make her son feel safe, and Yang was more than happy to help with that. The only good thing that had come from everything was that Jacques seemed to be doing as Weiss asked, and was leaving them alone. Though she wouldn't be surprised if that was only because he was still the primary focus of the paparazzi. "Bit of an understatement, but yeah," she breathed. "Well, I heard of a new authentic Australian place opening in the quarter," he offered. "You could always try there." That actually did sound good. Better than all the Vale restaurants she'd been applying to since Australian food was her specialty. "I'll give it a shot." Finally getting the fire started, Yang reached forward and washed her hands in the river before reaching in her own bag and pulling out some food. "What about you? How's work?" "It's certainly not dull," the man chuckled. "Had the most revolting smelling package the other day. Somebody tried to shove 10 cans of dog food into a small tube." "Was that somebody Ruby?" Both of them let out a small chuckle. "I wouldn't put it past her," Ty grinned. "She'd be cleaning it up, though. I cannot tell you how bad that mess stunk. Never had Zvi give me so much attention before." "I'll keep that in mind when I buy your birthday deodorant," she teased. "Oh, to dog food. You wouldn't find me complaining." The man laughed and snatched a piece of cucumber that she'd just cut. The house has been so empty lately that it was good to have someone happy to see me. Glancing sideways, Yang saw that, despite the smile on his face, there was a sadness in his eyes. Yang could definitely relate to that. The first few weeks after moving into Weiss' apartment had been tough. The emptiness had felt almost suffocating, the silence had pounded at her ears, and the feeling of unrest had been almost unbearable. As such, most of her time had been spent going out to see her friends or calling them to come over. However, knowing that they weren't supposed to talk about the past and the issues that had led her feeling like they needed space, Yang indeed began to sort out the chicken and continue the conversation. I suppose Ruby actually has a reason to go out now. She smiled. A new friend and a girlfriend. Tai hummed, a little pride in his voice, though Yang wasn't sure if Ruby and Ilya were actually at the girlfriend stage yet. A lot's changed for her this year. A lot's changed for all of us. Just look at me. Last year I had no idea what I was doing with my life. Now I'm applying for business courses next year and dating one of the most amazing people in the world. One of? Well, there's Ruby and Blake and Mom. She paused and prodded the coals, and would before looking at her dad. And you. His eyes widened slightly, and he turned to give her a weak smile. Now you're just being nice. I'm not. She shook her head. I know we have our issues, and that there's still a lot we have to work through, but I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't important to me. Catching his eye, she watched the smile fade as a serious look came over his face. For a few seconds, it looked like he wanted to say something, no doubt something that they weren't supposed to talk about, but he seemed to think better of it and reached out an arm to pull her into a sidelong hug. Despite all their troubles, she still leaned into it like a little girl and found her father's scent comforting. It's important to me too, Fireball. Giving a small nod into his shoulder and reaching out, she grabbed the chicken and placed it on the grill, the delicious smell of cooking meat rising into her nose and making her stomach grumble. So, the man said cautiously, I've got a few stories about this place if you want to hear them. Some even include Raven. Recognizing it as an olive branch and an attempt to be more open, Yang lifted her head from his shoulder and gave him an appreciative smile. I'd like that. She moved away and settled back against the rock while putting other food on the grill, ready to hear a few stories that she had never heard before. Yang couldn't help but feel a little disappointment as she pulled off her helmet. The second the soundproofing left her ears, the tumultuous roar of Vale's streets invaded them and caused her to wish she was still back on the island with her dad. The 3 hours she'd spent together eating food and talking by the river had actually been nice. Sadly, that peace, that serenity. Vale had none of it. Thankfully, though, the disappointment didn't last long. Shaking her hair free of the helmet's imprint, she looked over towards the window of Blake's store and saw a small group of her friends all sitting around the larger table next to the bookcase. With them working there, Blake and Ilya occupied the large couch, the former reading what Yang could only imagine was another law book, and the latter gently holding Ruby's hand as the younger girl talked excitedly about something. Sat to the side, looking at everyone curiously with wide green eyes, was Ruby's newest friend, Penny. The biggest surprise, however, was the woman sitting opposite them, her white hair shining as the sun reflected off of it. Yang had thought that the woman would be busy all day, but there she was. A soft smile pulled at her lips, and she switched off her engine, letting the low rumble die down before stepping aside and attaching her helmet to the lock. As she did, she heard a van pull up down the road and glanced at her mirror to see a man step out with a camera. It wasn't a big surprise, since not a single day had gone by without at least a couple of run-ins with the press, so she merely locked up her bike and walked over to the door of the coffee shop. Slipping inside, she turned around to watch the man approach and tap the glass where the NO press note was taped. Seeing a frustrated look on his face, she grinned happily to herself and walked over to where her friends were gathered. A murmured greeting rang out from the group, and she sat down next to her girlfriend. Hey, guys! She leaned down to press a kiss against Weiss' lips. I thought you were busy today. I am never too busy to be there for you after these kinds of things. Weiss smiled. So how did it go? Pretty good, Yang replied honestly. You and Dad didn't argue, did you? We got along fine, Ruby. She reassured the redhead, hearing a little worry in her little sister's tone. It was actually kinda nice. It really was. For the first time ever, She really felt like her dad had been fully open with her. During the 2 hours they'd sat there eating food and playing catch, the man had told her numerous stories about his school days. And though a lot of them had included Summer, Raven, and Crow, he had focused a little more around his relationship with Raven. She was grateful for that, as she knew it was something she was probably never going to hear the woman talk about herself. "So what are you guys talking about, Daddy Dickhole?" Despite the venomous tone of her voice, the girl seemed rather content cuddled up next to Ruby. "Yeah, Weiss was just telling us about how he's trying to say Willow's unfit to look after Whitley," Blake clarified. "Oh yeah, that shit show," Yang groaned, reaching out to snatch half of Blake's sandwich. Unfortunately, that had been Jacques' first move. Capitalizing on both Weiss and Willow's confessions that the older Schnee had been a heavy drinker, Jacques had immediately gone for the jugular and used it as proof that the boy should be with him while the court heard everyone out. Thankfully, despite all of his power, the court didn't seem to agree with that. "It's very unlikely to work," Weiss said, taking a sip of her drink. "But even if it does, what we've come out and said about him means that he won't get Whitley either." "So what'll happen to him?" Ruby asked curiously. "Well, Weiss is family and of legal age, so she could take custody of him until it's over," Blake answered, Weiss nodding to her. "Either way, Jacques won't be getting anywhere near him." "You could adopt your brother?" Penny asked with an excited tone. "That would be so much fun." As usual, the girl had completely misread the tone of the conversation. It was quite a frequent occurrence with the redhead, but nobody ever really minded. In fact, both Weiss and Ilya let out a small chuckle. "If it made him feel comfortable, then sure," Weiss grinned. "I am sure that it would." The perky redhead smiled at her reassuringly. "Adopting someone is a super amazing way to show someone that you love them." "Is that so?" A mischievous grin pulled at Yang's lips, and she leaned into her girlfriend. "Maybe I should adopt you." "I'm going to choose to ignore that one." Weiss rolled her eyes with amusement. "I'm going to choose to forget that one," Blake added, Yang sticking her tongue out at her. "Aren't you adopted, Penny?" "Yes, I am," the excitable girl said with a very happy nod. "My father says that when he saw me, he knew that he could give me a life nobody else could." Lifting up her prosthetic hand, she gave her fingers a wiggle. Though Yang didn't know a lot about Penny's dad, he certainly seemed like a very good man. From everything Weiss had said about how he conducted himself and how passionate about his work he was, she could certainly imagine the man being more than happy to use that excitement to give a girl a life she probably would never have otherwise. "Well, your father is certainly a good man." Weiss smiled at the earnest redhead. "And from what I heard from Edward, he's going to be given full support for his newest project so he can help even more people." "Oh yes. He is very excited about that. He has begun talking to himself again." "So has Blake," Ilya chuckled. "I think all those law books are getting to your head." "My head is fine, thank you." "Yeah, what is with that anyway?" Yang asked. "You just got in a whole bunch of books that I know you haven't read, and you're still reading those things instead." "They're fun," Blake shrugged dismissively. "And I'm thinking about attending law school, so they're helpful." "You are?" Both Ilya and Yang replied at the same time. That was not something Yang had been aware of. Though she certainly hadn't missed that her best friend had taken to reading law books over everything else, she had merely thought it was another one of the woman's passing obsessions. She definitely hadn't suspected that there was something more behind it. "I suppose," Blake admitted, a little hesitation in her voice. "I'm really enjoying the work I'm doing at the meetings, but they keep reminding me how much further we have to go. So I'm thinking I want to study civil law like my dad to really help the people." "Oh, that's..." Yang was unsure. That career path certainly seemed right for the girl, and was definitely something that she knew the woman could exceed at, but it was also Blake getting deeper into the white fang. A part of her was still cautious and worried for her friend. However, as Blake's amber eyes met hers, she remembered the promise she'd made. "That's great." She smiled at her best friend, choosing to trust her judgment instead of her worries. "That is really great," Weiss added with a nod. "Have you thought about where you're studying yet? Beacon has a great law department." "Yes," Penny chirped up again with a fervent nod. "It is really quite amazing, and then you can attend school with Rob Dash." "Penny!" Ruby interrupted her quickly, causing the girl's hands to jump to her mouth with a small apology. As every head around the table turned to face the younger girl, Ruby shook her head and tapped her fingers together anxiously. Her silver eyes fell to her lap, and she began to gently nibble on her lip. "Ruby?" Yang asked with a raised eyebrow. The girl remained quiet for a second, until Ilya reached out and rested a hand on her shoulder. "You may as well tell them now." The silver-eyed girl took a deep breath before giving Weiss a shy look. Knowing what they usually meant, Yang sat back and prepared for the rush of words that were about to be sent their way. "Well, I really wanted to go to Beacon, and I was gonna tell you a couple of weeks ago that I wanted to accept your offer to pay, but then everything happened with your parents, and you lost the company, and now you're starting your own, and I know that will be a lot of money, so I didn't know if you could still afford it." "Ruby. So I didn't want to ask, and Rubes?" Yang cut the rambling girl off firmly. "Maybe let Weiss talk before you pass out?" The girl looked slightly embarrassed as she sank into the couch, but stayed quiet as Weiss cast her a friendly smile. "Ruby, between my inheritance and the money I will make when selling my shares in the STC, I will not be struggling to fund the company, especially since I am not the only investor. If you want the money to go to Beacon, then all you have to do is ask for it." The young girl tapped her fingers together again. "Can you really afford it?" 10 times over," Weiss replied easily. "Then, I would like to go. If I'm accepted, then I would be happy to pay." There was not a hint of hesitance in her voice. "And for you, Bladash?" "No, thank you." The fauness shook her head before the woman could finish. "That is Ruby's dream, not mine. What I'm happy she's finally going for." The raven-haired girl flashed the younger one a warm smile, and Ruby immediately returned it. "Please," Yang chuckled, as if there was any chance she'd turn down Beacon. It was a lie. Yang knew there had been a chance Ruby would turn the offer down, but she knew that voicing it would only cause her sister more doubt. So keeping her thoughts to herself, she merely smiled encouragingly to the younger girl. However, while everyone else was smiling, she caught a worried look on Penny's face out of the corner of her eye. "I'm sorry, Ruby," the girl said in an uncharacteristically low voice. "I should not have said that." "It's okay," Ruby said soothingly, and picked up a few of the cups from the table. "I know you didn't mean to." "I know. I'm just not used to having friends. Or secrets. It is strange at first, but you will get used to it," Weiss offered. "MHM," Ruby nodded. "And there are plenty of perks, like Yang paying for cookies." "What?" Yang scowled at her sister, only for the girl to put on an innocent face that she had definitely learned from Zvi. "Ugh, fine. Why can't you be hesitant to take my money like you are with Weiss?" The girl didn't answer, only stuck out her tongue as she accepted the money and motioned for Penny to go with her. With a little bit of a dour look on her face, the other redhead lifted from her chair and took off after her. Following them with her eyes, Yang saw her sister quickly engage the girl in a conversation that didn't take long at all to put a smile on her friend's face, and felt a small swell of pride at how Ruby was turning out. "College, a new friend, a relationship." Yang sighed and slumped back into the chair, Weiss' hand coming out to take hers. "She's gotta be all grown up soon. Could at least try and sound a little happy for us," Ilya grumbled. "Oh, shush." Yang waved dismissively at the purple-eyed girl. "You know I am." "How are you two anyway?" Weiss asked curiously. "You seem happy together." "We're good," Ilya replied, the scowl quickly turning into a smile. "Still just taking things slow, you know. Whatever she's comfortable with is fine by me." "I can't believe I completely misread that part of her." When Ruby had finally come to her after her talk with Weiss, Yang had actually felt a little ashamed of herself. Never once in all the time raising her had she considered that Ruby might not feel the same way about relationships as other people, and she could only imagine how frustrating all the little jokes about her and Oscar's friendship must have been. Needless to say, the apologies had been issued quickly. "Well, you are an idiot sometimes." Yang saw the tiniest of smirks from underneath her best friend's book. "It's to be expected." "Wow! And I thought you were my friend." Yang chuckled as the pun earned a low groan from the others, and a shake of Blake's head. "Unfortunately, I am." Yang couldn't lie. It felt good to be trading insults again. She'd missed it over the last few weeks. Missed the feeling of being able to casually take a jab at her friend and not risk having it turn into an argument. Thankfully, that seemed to have begun to pass, and as they waited for Ruby to return with more drinks and food, Yang happily sank back into the couch and engaged her friend in conversations. For 2 hours, they all simply talked. About upcoming exams, their future courses they wished to take, Weiss business, about anything and everything. It was fun, and the more they talked, the more Yang found herself looking at her girlfriend. There was a smile on her face, a smile that she hadn't seen for a while. Weiss was happy. Despite having lost the company and having to start again from scratch, she was happy. And just seeing that smile was enough for Yang to know that they had made the right decision. Because no matter what happened, Yang knew that she would more than happily spend the rest of her days making sure the woman kept smiling in such a way. Eventually, though, the meeting had to come to an end. And as Penny left and Ruby stood up to start her shift, as did Blake and Ilya. "All right." Ilya smiled and pressed a kiss into Ruby's cheek, causing the girl to blush as she took off towards the counter with a smile. "We should head out too. Still need to set up for tonight's meeting." "We should head home too." Yawning slightly, Weiss sat up from Yang's lap, where she had been sitting for the past 30 minutes. "I finally have a free afternoon, and I have yet to actually make good on my promise to help Yang study." "Good luck with that," Blake smirked. "Getting her to study is something I gave up on a long time again." "Not my fault you were boring," Yang shrugged. "Well, I am sure I can think of a way to keep you interested," Weiss said quietly, and wrapped her arms around her waist. Over the woman's shoulder, Yang saw Blake shake her head. I bet you could." "All right." Ilya sighed with a fake gag. "We're leaving before we have to witness any more of this. Later." "Your loss." Yang chuckled, pulling Weiss in closer and pressing a kiss against the top of her head. "See you tomorrow." Muttering a goodbye, Blake and Ilya walked away and left the shop, leaving them standing alone. "Wanna call Hazel? Or wanna take my bike?" Weiss hummed, pulling backwards and looking up at her thoughtfully. "As much as I will likely regret it, your bike." Feeling adventurous." Yang grinned. "Let's go then." Before moving, Weiss leaned up and pressed a kiss against her lips, sending a rush of heat through her body. Instinctively, she leaned into it and let out a small hum, reaching her hand down to take her beautiful girlfriend's hand. Breaking the kiss with great difficulty, she flashed her a mischievous grin and pulled her towards the door so that they could head home. Now that was definitely needed. That would probably be the biggest understatement Weiss ever made. Though Yang had definitely never failed to satisfy her, after almost 2 months of being too busy for sex, Weiss was in heaven. Her chest was heavy, her breaths coming in little more than hurried pants. Her body tingled from pure pleasure, but also a little pain where her fingers and toes had squeezed so tightly that she had no doubt there was going to be a few holes in the sheets. And her mind? For the first time in weeks, her mind was clear, the sheer scale of her orgasm having removed anything that wasn't to do with her, Yang, and the bed they were laying in. "I could tell." Yang grinned, massaging her jaw slightly and holding out her arm. Weiss immediately closed the gap and rested her head on Yang's chest, draping one of her still shaking legs over her girlfriend's. Glancing past the girl, she saw a mess of clothes and study books. Neither had lasted long when the study session had started, and though Weiss was definitely going to keep it in her back pocket for the future, she was definitely not going to try it again as a way to help her girlfriend learn better. "Remind me why we went so long without it again?" she asked, her heart still pounding against her chest. "I have no idea." Yang chuckled, her hand coming up to glide lazily across her sweaty back. "Definitely not happening again, though." "My thoughts exactly," Weiss hummed in full agreement. "Though I'm not sure when I will next have a free afternoon." "I don't mind." Weiss could tell that Yang was telling the truth. "I know how much this company means to you. Though, I'm not sure on the name. Santa? Schnee and Auburn's Neoteric Technological Advancements." It was definitely a mouthful, and was very likely to be revised in the future, but Weiss was actually rather fond of the acronym. Her grandfather had loved Christmas, and a year had yet to pass without someone commenting on the irony that Nicholas Schnee not only shared the Associated Saint's name, but also that his general appearance was not too far off either. "I want to give the world a gift," she reasoned with a smile up at the blonde. "Just like my grandfather did. Santa seems like an appropriate name, though I do agree it's a little on the nose." "Just a little?" "Oh, shush." Weiss replied, rolling over a little so that she was practically laying on top of her girlfriend. Says the one who wants to call her restaurant Goldie Cooks. And I will hire only blondes who make killer porridge, Yang said with a smirk. Shaking her head and letting out a short burst of laughter, Weiss shuffled up a little and pressed a kiss against the woman's luscious lips. Enjoying the warmth that pulsed through her body, she hummed and ran a hand through the mess of blonde hair. After a few seconds of indulging her desires, though, she pulled away and stared down into the beautiful pear or lilac orbs. But if you keep distracting me from my stewed eye dash. Me? Weiss replied with false indignation. You are the one who started this. Not my fault you took your top off. I took my jacket off. Still a top. And you took everything else off. Well, they were all gonna come off eventually. I just saved us some time. Weiss shook her head amusedly at the grin on her girlfriend's face. And thank God I did. Getting the apartment to ourselves is almost impossible now. Not that I'm complaining. You are not wrong, Weiss admitted. Though Weiss was definitely happy to have her family living with her, and the apartment definitely had enough rooms, even she couldn't deny that it was hard to get a moment alone. Though Whitley rarely stepped foot downstairs and preferred to use the upstairs living room, her mother had taken to aimlessly wandering the apartment in search of something to do and could appear randomly at any moment. Klein had also moved in until he could find a place of his own, and while the man was excellent at his job, there was no denying that having such a competent butler meant his tendency to pop up whenever something happened became a little much at times. 5 is a lot of people, even for this such a large apartment. It is. Yang bit her lip anxiously. So, what if it became 4? Huh? Weiss tilted her head in confusion. Well? Yang let out a small sigh and shifted to sit up. Following suit, Weiss moved from her position on top of the woman and sat cross-legged beside her. I'm thinking that maybe it's time I went back to my dad's. Oh. Weiss felt her face drop, but Yang quickly continued. It's not that I haven't enjoyed living here with you, or that I want to stop, because I don't, You need to focus on your family and work right now, and I need to fix things with my dad and spend time with Ruby before she goes to college. Weiss couldn't say she wasn't disappointed. After all, she had really enjoyed living with Yang. Having someone to come back to every day had been much more satisfying than she could ever have imagined, and she didn't want to give that up. However, she could definitely see Yang's point. So long as the woman was away from home, it was so much easier for her to avoid her father instead of fixing things. Something she had been doing ever since moving in. I'm sorry, Yang grimaced. I know things have finally started to work out in our fave dash. It's fine, Yang. Weiss cut her off with a shake of her head, reaching out to cup her amazing girlfriend's cheek. Your relationship with your dad comes first. You're not disappointed? A little? Weiss admitted with a weak smile. But you have to do what is right for you, and I would rather we live together because you want to, not because you are running from something. Yang's hand came up and clutched hers, squeezing reassuringly. I've loved every second of the last 6 months living with you, and I'll definitely be back once everything is sorted. Besides, I'll be staying over regularly, and you can stay over whenever too, so we'll still see each other plenty. Weiss knew that was definitely true. Even living apart, there was no doubt that most of their nights would still be spent together. So, perking up a little at the fact she knew she would still be waking up beside the blonde, she gave the woman a genuine smile and collapsed back onto her side, pulling Yang with her. I think that's a deal I can live with. She grinned as Yang hovered on top of her, her lilac eyes slowly swapping from doubt to lust. Though I would not be opposed to a little more convincing. I bet you I'll dash. Yang's words turned into a small groan as a loud knock on the door rang throughout the room. Sister? Can't we just pretend we're not in? Yang whispered, Weiss quickly tapping her on the face with a smile before pushing her aside. She, too, was a little frustrated at being interrupted, but she hopped off the bed and wrapped the sheet around herself before running over to the door and pulling it open. Stood in the hallway dressed in the vest she had bought him a few weeks earlier and dress pants was Whitley. I didn't know you were back. She smiled at him. Are you okay? Yes, but Willow just received a call from her lawyer. He would like to see us as well. Oh, right. She breathed, looking behind her to see that it was just over an hour before her mother's appointment. "All right, I will shower and meet you downstairs." The boy stared at her for a second before rolling his eyes and walking off, while muttering something under his breath that sounded a lot like adults. Closing the door after him, she turned back to her girlfriend, who was laid naked on the bed with no cover to hide herself and her hands behind her head, and let out a low groan. Oh, how she wished she could join her again. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "It's fine." The blonde laughed, pushing herself up onto her knees and moving to the edge of the bed, Weiss walking to meet her and wrapping her arms around her neck. "Life calls." "MHM," she grumbled, leaning down to press a brief peck onto her girlfriend's lips. "You'll just have to convince me some more another time." "I can't wait." Jan laughed. "Now go and get in the shower." Despite giving the woman a nod, Weiss leaned down and pressed their lips together once more, feeling Yang's hand slip down her waist and take a hold of her, but she let out a hungry groan. Just as always, things with Yang felt perfect. Kissing her, touching her, even just being near her, it was so easy to forget everything else happening in her life and just enjoy the moment. Unfortunately, all she had was a moment, and once it passed she was forced herself to pull away. She didn't pull away too far though, and let her forehead rest against the other woman's as she looked longingly into her eyes. "I love you," she breathed. "I could say it 1,000,000 times, and I still doubt I could ever truly express just how much I mean those words." "Don't worry," the blonde chuckled, her hands leaving her ass and returning to her waist. "I already know. And I feel the same." Feeling butterflies in her stomach, Weiss gave the woman a small nod and finally pulled away. A smile was exchanged, and she reached out to run a hand lovingly across her girlfriend's cheek. It had taken so much time and cost her so much to achieve, but she finally had everything she ever wanted sitting right in front of her. That alone was more than enough to let her know that everything had been worth it. She was finally free to live life as she wanted, and to experience the only future she had ever truly been excited for. So, with one last kiss, she took a contented breath and made her way to the shower, ready to face whatever it was that awaited her next. Chapter 90. 3 years later. Yam couldn't believe it was September already. Where once the sky had been dominated by the summer sun blazing down on the city, the clouds of fall had finally arrived to temper its heat. The once stifled air had turned into a pleasant breeze that had begun to tickle her face, picking up the numerous aromas of her abandoned picnic and filling her nose with the scent of strawberries and cheese and still warm bread. As divine as the smells were though, they could hardly compare to the beautiful vista before her. Perched on the edge of a cliff with her feet dangling over, Yang looked out over the small village of Patch. Despite being on the highest point on the island, she could still just about make out the town's inhabitants going around their business. The occasional car idly strolled by, and every now and again a soft bark from the park on the edge of town would just manage to make its way up to her. "Enjoying yourself?" Weiss' angelic voice greeted her ears, a pair of lithe arms wrapping around her shoulders from behind. What little relaxation had come from admiring her birthplace quickly began to fade as the nerves settled back in. Nevertheless, she adorned a bright smile. "Better now you're back." The soft vibration of Weiss' chuckle against her back felt like heaven. "I was gone for 2 minutes. 2 minutes too long," she huffed playfully, leaning backwards on her elbows so that she was looking up at her girlfriend. Yang didn't know how it was possible, but the woman was more beautiful than the day they'd met. "Shush." The woman laughed and sat down beside her. "You have me to yourself all day." "About time," she smiled back. While it was said in jest, there was a little truth to it. Over the last 3 years, both of their schedules had become so busy with work and college that it had been incredibly difficult to find more than a few hours together. That lack of time together had inevitably caused more than a few arguments, but they were always resolved quickly, and had also made Yang much more appreciative of the time that they did manage to spend together. "Well, there should be more opportunities now that you are a Beacon graduate and have your business degree," Yang finished in a teasing tone, earning a scowl from her girlfriend. "I think you've mentioned that once or twice. Or, every single day for the past 3 weeks. Well, excuse me for pointing out that I have more free time." Weiss pouted. "I can always take up another college kudash." "Don't you dare." Reaching out, she gently poked the woman in the stomach and received a soft giggle in return. I'm actually looking forward to seeing you for more than just a good night this year. Me too. The woman leaned in, and Yang put her arm around her. Just think about how great it will be next year when you graduate, and we have twice the amount of time. I doubt any description of heaven comes close to what I imagine that'll be like. Yang scoffed. It would be nice, huh? Weiss sighed longingly. We could watch movies again. Go out to dinner. Actually take that vacation to Vital we've been talking about. That would be perfect. We could also do this more often. They both fell silent, and Yang felt Weiss' hand linked with her own. Just the thought of having the time to be able to do all of those things again was enough to put butterflies back in her stomach. As the silence stretched on though, she slowly felt her nerves start to grow. You know what else we could do? If you say sex, I will hit you. No, not. Okay, definitely that too. She felt Weiss shake her head against her shoulder. But I was kind of thinking about something else. Oh. Well. While it was something they had already talked about to the point where there was no way Weiss didn't know it was coming, Yang paused hesitantly, unsure exactly of how to say it. She'd always sucked with words, and had been trying to find the right ones for weeks. Unfortunately, nothing had really felt right. However, sitting on the edge of a peaceful cliff with a beautiful view of the place she loved the most with the person she loved the most at her side, Yang knew that she was never going to find another moment as perfect as the one they were sharing at that moment. So, swallowing her nerves, she pressed forward in hopes that just speaking from her heart would be enough. We've been together for almost 4 years now. I am aware. Will you dash? I'm sorry. Looking down, Yang saw a smirk on her girlfriend's face. Please continue. Okay, she breathed. Well, those 4 years have been really good. Better than good, actually. I mean, we've been busy and barely get to spend time together, but somehow I still love you more than I did when we met and… Yang cut herself off as she realized she was rambling. Why was it so hard to find a few simple words to tell the woman how she felt? You know what? Fuck it, she breathed. No, you were doing well. Weiss grinned up at her. I love when you're the nervous one. Please continue. Nope, she grumbled. Oh, come on. Weiss laughed, twisting around so that she was facing her, a wide smile on her face. Nope. Moment's over, she said playfully. Yang. Nope, time to go home. As Yang made to stand up, Weiss quickly grabbed her shoulder and straddled her lap. Don't you dare. You realize we're on a cliff, right? Yang said with a raised eyebrow. I do, but I am not moving until you ask me what you want to ask me. Ugh, fine. Yang groaned jokingly, placing a hand on Weiss' waist for a little more peace of mind. Reaching her other hand into her pocket, she pulled out a small wooden box and gazed lovingly into the bright blue eyes of her girlfriend. She couldn't even count the amount of changes that had occurred in her life since meeting the woman. All she knew was that almost all of them were positive, and that she was more than ready to commit to that continuing for the rest of her life. So, as the playful mood slowly dissipated to be replaced by a more serious one, Yang felt her breathing begin to deepen and bit her lip. With one last breath, she swallowed what remained of her nerves and pushed forward. Weiss, she said, her voice so low that it wouldn't have been heard had Weiss not been holding her breath. I think I just made it clear that I can't even put into words how happy you make me. And though I know you could definitely do it, I know you feel the same. So… She flipped open the lid of the box to reveal a folded swathe of bright yellow fabric. White embroidery ran along its edges, slowly curving into the center of the fabric to form a snowflake before moving back out to the edge only to repeat a few inches later. Will you marry me? The world seemed to fall into slow motion, and it was Yang's turn to hold her breath as Weiss reached out to gently run her finger across the fabric. With each eternity that passed, the woman's smile grew wider and wider, and her face grew closer and closer. You have no idea how long I have been waiting to say yes to that question. Before Yang could reply, Weiss' lips were on hers, and she felt her stomach flip. As reality caught up with her, her heart began to hammer in her chest so fast that she thought it might burst from happiness. She'd had many happy moments in her life, so many of which had been due to her relationship with Weiss, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could compare to the feeling of euphoric relief that was beginning to surge through her body. And if the shaking that she could feel in her hand from Weiss' back was any indication, the feeling was mutual. After a couple of seconds though, Weiss pulled away and quickly held out her left arm, her right coming up to bat away the tears that were already beginning to form in her eyes. Not wasting a second, Yang removed the brown band she had given her years ago as a promise to return after fixing things with her dad, and tied the new one in place. "Do you like it?" she asked in a trembling voice as she wound the yellow fabric just under her armpit. "Like it?" Weiss gave a wet chuckle. "I love it, you dolt. But you are absolutely wearing a ring." "Well, you're engaging in a Mistral custom, so I think I can live with an Atlas one," Yang chortled, tying the fabric off with a neat bow and looking up at the leaky-eyed woman. "Especially if it's for you." Reaching up, she ran a hand along her fiancé's cheek and wiped away a tear, feeling one slip down her face at the same time, and pulled the girl back into the kiss and let the world fade away. With the proposal accepted and the band tied, it was their first official kiss as an engaged couple, and Yang could say with zero doubt that it was easily the best one of her life. Chapter 91. TWTCI. Raven Ambivalence. The forest was creepier than Raven remembered. With its thick canopy of browning leaves and the almost black bark of the trees, the darkness that surrounded her was all-encompassing with barely a speck of light from the midday sun to be seen. The smell of seaweed and soggy dirt filled her nose, and the snapping of branches underfoot and the scurrying of creatures filled the air. For most, the combination of those elements would be enough to make someone believe they had stepped into the setting of a horror film, but to Raven, it merely felt familiar, like a distant memory. Then again, she supposed it was. It would not have been an exaggeration to say that a majority of her teen years had been spent wandering through the seemingly endless stretch of woodlands. Whenever things had been rough at home, or she'd had a fight with Ty or her brother, or she had simply wanted to be alone, the woods had been where she would hide. The silence, the isolation, it had always calmed her and helped her clear her mind. As such, light was unnecessary, as her feet merely remained on the path out of sheer instinct, guiding themselves towards the light that hovered in the distance. Just as well they did, too, since Raven's mind was as far from what laid ahead of her as it could be. She still wasn't entirely sure why she was on the path in the first place. The entirety of the last week had been spent telling herself that she wouldn't be. That when the day came, she would remain within the confines of the city, either enjoying her day off or preparing for the upcoming trip with her daughter. She'd been certain that both would have been so much more fun. However, she had barely even begun to sort through her clothes before her mind had turned back to what day it was. Unfortunately, no matter what she did, she'd been unable to rid the truth from her thoughts, and had left the apartment to where she knew she had to be. Sadly, the familiar woods were not her destination. No, that would be the increasingly growing light that was beginning to illuminate the edges of the forest. Just beyond the trees lay something she had been avoiding for quite some time, but the time had finally come. So, taking a deep breath as she felt the gentle warmth of the autumn sun against her face, she stepped out of the tree-line and into the golden grass of Patch's highest cliff face. Sat in the middle of the field, only a few meters from the cliff, was a large, gray slab of stone. Despite it having been 19 years since Summer had thrown away their friendship, seeing the grave of her best friend still caused a twinge of pain in her chest. She still remembered the day Crow had told her. As opposed to their usual method of communication at the time, which mainly consisted of an occasional text message, her brother had actually flown out to tell her in person. It had been the first time since leaving that she'd seen him in person, and the second she'd opened the door she'd known something was wrong. As he told her what had happened, she'd resisted the urge to throw up. No matter what their issues, Summer had once been someone she loved like a sister, and though those days were long since over, not a single part of her was happy that the woman was gone from the world. Crow had stayed for a few days after that, and for the first time in years, they had supported each other before returning for the funeral together. Needless to say, that day still held a spot amongst the worst days of her life, only made worse by having to watch from the tree-lines. Once everyone had left, she approached the grave to say her goodbye, but nothing had come. For almost an hour, she stood there in complete silence, unable to find the words, before walking away, promising to herself that she would never return to the cliff. Clearly, she'd been wrong, but even 14 years later, as she stood before the woman's grave again, she had no idea what to say. Scratching her hair, she took a small breath and decided to start with something basic. "Hey, Thorns," she muttered. At least she was doing better than last time. "Been a while, huh? Bet you thought I'd never stop by again. Well, it's not like I don't have a good reason not to." She stopped and sat down beside the grave. As she did, she could feel her aging body give a slight twinge and shifted into a more comfortable position. I take back what I said when you turned 21. She grumbled. Getting old is less fun than you think. Pretty shit, actually. She shook her head. What the fuck am I talking about? She let out a sigh. What am I even doing here? Same thing I am, I'm guessing. The familiar sound of her brother's voice caught her ear, and she turned to see the man climbing up from a hidden path on the side of the cliff. Just as always, he wore a plain gray shirt and a pair of dark red dress pants, and his raven black hair was pushed back in his best attempt at looking windswept. Much like her own whenever she looked in the mirror, his red eyes seemed tired, and a small scraggly beard could be seen on his chin. I highly doubt that, Raven replied, nodding towards the flask in his hand. Getting drunk again, I see. Nothing else to do today. The man shrugged, slouching his way over and dropping to sit next to her. Want to join me? I'm good. She declined the flask. I don't want to end up like Corvus, thanks. Low blow, sis. Low blow. He fell quiet for a few seconds, but when he spoke again, his voice was a little more sincere. I have it under control, just. I'd rather not deal with today sober. Raven understood that. Ever since they were kids, Crow had always been one to try and find any way he could to avoid dealing with difficult situations. They both had. For her, it had come in the form of pushing everyone away so that they didn't even have the chance to disappoint her, and for him it had been to pretend as if nothing had happened at all. Crazy to think it's been 27 years since we met her, huh? Feels like just yesterday she was smiling at us and asking us to sign up for the club. MMM, she hummed noncommittally. In truth, she didn't feel the same way. Do you remember the first Thanksgiving after meeting her? He continued. When she convinced us to sneak out after Dad fell asleep? Then she and Ty met us in the park with a small turkey? Raven finished with a nod. I remember. She remembered very well, in fact. Just like most of their childhood, there had been very little to be thankful about, and a vast majority had been spent trying their very best to avoid Corvus, their drunkard father. The sun had already been setting by the time they'd arrived at the park, and a few hours had been spent enjoying a small supper of turkey sandwiches and soda. Despite not even knowing the truth about their home life at the time, the pair had still given her something to be genuinely thankful for. That was the first time I ever felt like I was a part of something that was even close to a family. His words mirror her own thoughts, and he took a sip from his flask. Raven closed her eyes at those words. They were hardly incorrect. From that day forth, the things she was thankful for only began to grow in number. First it was Summer, who had stuck by her side no matter how many times she tried to push her away. Then Ty, who never failed to make her laugh. Then both of their parents, who'd taken them in after everything with Corvus had come to light. Though it had been brief, for a few great years Raven had known how it felt to actually have a support network. To have friends and a family. Yeah, she nodded. I still remember the first night we all slept at Summer's house. Playing games till midnight, Fiona baking muffins for us while shouting at Eden for making all that noise trying to fix the washing machine. Ty almost breaking his neck trying to skate down the slide in the garden. He was such an idiot. They both chuckled lightly and exchanged a look. Though she saw the usual signs of pain in her brother's eyes, she also saw a glint of happiness at recalling the memories. However, just like she had with Young, Raven had been trying to be more honest with her brother, so turned away from him as the smiles faded. But unlike for you, those memories all feel like a lifetime ago to me, she admitted. A lifetime that I wish hadn't existed at all. Crow was quiet. Hearing the flask slosh behind her, she felt a small pang of guilt in her chest. She knew that whenever she looked back, that sliver of happiness that the man had moments ago would be gone. You still can't forgive her? It's not that simple, Raven replied. Yes, she gave me a family, but she also tore it away. What she did. How she did it. She knew what it would do, that to make him choose was to throw away everything me and her were, and she still did it. I thought we were sisters, but she showed me that day that whatever we had meant nothing to her. Or at least not as much as Ty did. Crow paused again, and Raven finally looked back at him to see him looking away from the gravestone. I supposed. But I know she regretted it. You were always a sore point for her, and every time Jan called her mom, I could see in her eyes just how much she hated herself for what she did. And that's supposed to make me forgive her? Raven asked coldly. Regret doesn't change what she did, and her being dead doesn't mean I have to forgive her either. I know. The man grumbled, his tone returning to its usual dour tone. "Can we just change the topic?" "There he goes again," Raven remarked internally, unsurprised by her brother's inability to hear bad things said about the woman. 27 years later, and the flame he'd harbored for her burned was bright as ever. However, not wanting to get into an argument with him, she relented and let out a small sigh. "Fine," she breathed. "So I'm guessing you heard the good news? About your sentence being lifted?" She nodded. "Yeah. Ruby mentioned it. Said Yang's really happy about it too." That was definitely something that caused a small well of pride to bloom with her chest. Her relationship with Yang was definitely one of the best things that had happened to her in years, and though she knew Yang would likely never refer to her as mom, she was still more than satisfied with what they had. It was still more than she believed she deserved. "MHM," she hummed. "We're riding down to the bike rally in Wheelhaven next week to celebrate. Should be a fun weekend." "Well, it's a fun place. Mention my name in Spokes Bar, and they'll give you a discount." "Known by name in a bar in a small town 400 miles from here?" Raven asked with a raised eyebrow. "I thought you said you had it under con dash." "It's not like th dash." "Sure looks like it to me." The man let out a frustrated breath at the exchange and took a sip from his flask, not exactly helping his case. "I gave his bar a shout out in an article I wrote 2 years ago, and it helped out his business," he explained. "Why do you always gotta think the worst of me?" "Oh, I'm sorry," Raven replied sarcastically. "The flask you've been drinking from this whole time didn't exactly give me a reason to think otherwise." "Yeah, well, maybe you should focus on your own issues instead of mine," he huffed. "I am," Raven scowled back. "Me and Yang are. I'm talking about Eden." "Oh." She could hardly refute that. It had been months since Summer's parents had begun to reach out to try and contact her, and not a week had gone by without a message reminding her that she was welcome back to their house. Much like most things in her life, though, as soon as they came in, she deleted them. Eden and Fiona were Summer's parents, part of a life she had left behind, and no matter how much she missed their kindness, she wasn't sure she was ready to go back to it. "Yeah," Crow scowled. "So don't try lecturing me when you can't even face your own problems." They both remained quiet for a while. Having spent most of her life deflecting, Raven knew exactly what the man was doing, but she let it go. Though they were much closer than they had been in years, she wasn't sure they were at the point where she could press him about his life choices. "Why are you avoiding him anyway?" "Because I don't need a parent," Raven replied dismissively. "I'm not a child anymore." "Could have fooled me," her brother replied and stood up with a groan. "Besides, I thought the whole reason you came back was your family." "I came back for Yang," she corrected him. "Nothing else. And what an exciting life that will be." "Just because you like surrounding yourself with family doesn't mean we all do, little brother." "Then I guess that is my cue to leave." The man yawned, drinking the last of whatever was in his flask. "If you want to ignore the people who care about you, then fine, but remember, that's a choice you're making." Turning away from him, as he began to walk away, she let out a sigh and leaned back on her arms. She knew he was right, of course, that it was merely her own fears that were stopping her from reconnecting with two people that she genuinely did care for, but those fears were not unfounded. The last time she had done that, it had ended poorly, and it had taken 19 years to find anyone she trusted enough to keep around. "Crow," she called out to one of those people, hearing him stop a few meters away. "Talk to a therapist. Trust me, they help." All she received in return was a soft hum before the footsteps continued, eventually faded from earshot as he reached the tree-line. Whether the man took her advice or not, that was his choice. However, finally alone with the grave again, Raven cast it a single glance and let out a small annoyed breath. "This is all your fault, you know?" she grumbled, pushing herself onto a knee. "You couldn't just be happy with what you had. No, you had to take all I had too." She shook her head and reached out to lay a hand on the slab of stone, and feeling of sadness taking hold of her. "And now you're not even here for me to shout at you." Letting go of the grave, she stood to her feet and turned to follow her brother into the forest. Just as she suspected, nothing had been gained by visiting the cliff. However, just as she reached the border, she turned back to look at the sunbathed grave and shoved her hands into her pocket. "Goodbye, thorns," she muttered, knowing that she would never return. Letting out a small sigh as she threw her jacket onto the table, Just beside the door, Raven looked up at her empty apartment. The living room was as sparse could be, with only a small couch and a television haphazardly placed near a wall so that she could relax after her long days at work. A tiny kitchen sat on the other end of the room, and 2 doors led off either side, one to the bathroom and one to the bedroom. It wasn't much, but it served its purpose, and was at the very least better than the prison cell she'd had less than a year ago. Still, with her recent conversation with her brother still repeating in her head, something about the emptiness struck her differently. When returning to Vale, she had no idea whether she would even be staying or not. While she'd hoped that Yang would be open to getting to know her, the potential that she might have refused had always been just as likely in her mind. As such, she hadn't really cared what her apartment looked like. However, despite it having been over half a year since Yang had accepted her, she'd still yet to do anything to make her apartment feel more comfortable. Not that Raven needed comfort, that is. She was perfectly fine with what she had, but it was hard to deny that the way she was living was yet more confirmation that what Crow had said was true. Still, not caring enough to face that issue at that moment, she shook it free from her head and made her way to the kitchen, pressing the answer machine as she went. "You have 4 new messages," the machine announced. "Guess I'm popular today." She yawned, stretching her arms above her head and feeling her spine pop as the first message began to play. "Hello, Miss Bramlin. This is Polly Pepper calling on behalf of Meryl Candida Dash." Delete. Raven cut it off, making a mental note to remove herself from those lists when she had the chance. "Hey, Raven," chimed a familiar voice. "It's Callie. I hope you don't mind, but I grabbed your number from Yang. So me and Willow, you know Wise Mom, are getting together for a little girls' night tomorrow, and I know you generally prefer to just do your own thing, but we were wondering if you wanted to join. We could even celebrate your new freedom. If you're interested, just swing by my house tomorrow around 7. Thanks, Yang," she muttered, pushing aside the strawberry hot chocolate powder and grabbing the tea leaves to sort out the drink. While she had in fact talked to both Callie and Willow a few times in passing, she would hardly have deemed those occasions enough to be invited to their girls' nights. No doubt her daughter had played a part in organizing that, but as Callie had said, it wasn't really her scene anymore. Though maybe if she wasn't busy, she could at least stop by and thank them for the invite. "This is an automated message to inform you that your car in Sadash." Delete, she repeated, picking up the kettle and going to pour it into her cup. However, as she did, an all too familiar voice came through the speaker and she stopped in her tracks. It was soft and motherly, and so very much like her former best friends. "Raven?" Fiona's voice was cautious. It's me, Fiona." Placing the kettle down, Raven closed her eyes and listened. "I just wanted to call and see how you were doing. I know today is always rough for Crow and Ty, and despite the brave face you always put on, I know it probably is for you too. But I guess you're not home. Or maybe you're just avoiding me. I wouldn't really blame you." There was a slight pause. "I know a lot of things have happened, Tea Leaf, and I can't imagine how much it all must have hurt you, but the day we took you in, I promised you this was always going to be your home, and it still is. We love you every bit as much as we love Summer, and you are always welcome here, so please, please just come home." The message ended, and Raven leaned against the counter with a hung head. Hearing the closest thing to a mother she'd ever known sound so desperate had hurt more than she thought it would, and she couldn't help but remember exactly what the night she arrived at Summer's house had been like. Despite hiding it, she'd been so scared at the time. It had been almost 2 weeks of constantly worrying what was going to happen to her. Where would she go? Would she be separated from Crow? What would happen to her friends? And her school? What would people say when they found out? Combined with the constant questioning and being moved to 2 different care houses, it had all been too much, and many of the nights had been spent locked inside a room crying to herself. When she arrived at Summers, she'd feared that yet more questions were about to come her way. Though she knew Fiona and Eden well already, they had always been the nosy type, but that day they were different. Where usually she would be expected to eat at the table while at their house, they'd allow her and Crow to eat in the conservatory. Not that much had been eaten. In fact, for almost the entirety of the first day, neither of them had asked them anything more than whether they wanted to use the bathroom, and for the first time in 2 weeks, they had both gone to bed without somebody badgering them about what was happening. However, unable to sleep that night, she'd been awake when the door to the room she was sharing with Summer had crept open at 3 in the morning. "Raven?" Fiona's voice whispered in the darkness. Not wanting to talk, she pretended to be asleep. Pretending to be asleep? The woman said, stepping into the room and sitting down on the edge of the bed. I don't blame you. No doubt you've had enough stuffy adults trying to get you to open up to them. Well, you don't have to worry about that here. You can talk to us, of course, but if our wit is up to you. We just want you to feel safe, and to know that for as long as you want it to be, this house will be your home. Okay? She hadn't responded, but Fiona didn't seem to mind. Okay. Well, you let me know if you want anything. Food, clothes, books, that specialty you like. Whatever it is, all you need to do is ask. The woman hadn't touched her, or tried to comfort her in any way. All she'd done was talk, and Raven still appreciated that. Once she finished, she got up and left the room, and just that little bit of reassurance had finally helped her fall to sleep. She still missed those days. Still missed Fiona and Eden. But as much as she would love to see them again, she was unsure if it was appropriate. They were Summer's parents, and they had looked after her because she was Summer's friend. With Summer gone, would there even still be a place for her? They said there would, but what if they were wrong and once again everything fell apart? That's a choice you're making. Crow's voice rang in her head yet again, causing her to let out a low sigh. After all, plenty of people were reaching out, and yet there she was, standing in a dingy apartment that could quite easily pass for being vacant. Maybe her brother was right. Maybe she was forcing her own isolation, too scared of being hurt to even try. But how did she fix that? How did she get past years of pain and disappointment to try for something more substantial? She'd done so for Young, but that was because she was her daughter, and her biggest regret. But could she do the same for 2 more people she loved? She didn't know. What she did know, though, was that she was tired. Tired of thinking, tired of doubting. So, letting out another low sigh, she poured out her drink and moved over to the couch, hoping that the calm the fragrant liquid always provided might help her find some answers. Wrapping her jacket tightly around herself, Raven walked down the quiet street. It had been quite some time since she had found herself on that particular corner of Patch, but just like the rest of the island, not much had really changed. Though the world had moved on, Patch didn't care and still tended to prefer the old-school suburban look. Comprising mostly of bungalows, the street was littered with small green and blue houses surrounded by lush green lawns and white picket fences. While nowhere near as idyllic as its appearance would suggest, there was no denying that living in a place where everybody knew who you were definitely had its charm. It was one that had always been lost on Raven. But for the Roses, it was perfect. They loved people, and people loved them. Quite often after first meeting them, she had believed them to simply be too good to be true. After all, kind and compassionate people had not exactly been commonplace in her life. Fortunately, while they certainly had their own share of issues, most of which stemmed from having had Summer while they were only 16, they were in fact every bit as good as they appeared. Eden, Summer's father, was pretty much the opposite of Raven's own in every way possible. He worked hard to support his family, but though he often came home tired and occasionally cranky, he still always made sure to put aside some time for his wife and kid, and even her when she'd moved in. Fiona, on the other hand, was just as fierce as she was compassionate. Though from the outside, she looked like a traditional housewife, taking care of the house and cooking the meals. Anybody who spent a single day within the walls of the pair's home would instantly be able to tell that she was the one in charge of the house. Needless to say, Raven had loved living there. The two had been an amazing support net for her, and never failed to make her feel like a part of their family, but she still wasn't sure she was ready to fall back into that. It was why she'd opted to park her bike almost 2 streets away. No doubt Mrs. Green had already told them about her bike, as well as every other minor detail she'd noticed that day, and she really didn't like the idea of Sleipnir alerting them to her arrival. After all, so long as she was quiet, she could choose to leave at any point. She still wasn't exactly sure what she was going to do when she actually arrived at the house. However, she did know that it was finally time to make up her mind. Whether that decision was to let them back into her life or to tell them to stop calling, though, she didn't know. But seeing as she could see their house only a few meters away, she was quickly running out of time. Letting out a small sigh as she passed by Mr. Soot's house, she heard a shrill shriek come from inside, and looked through the window to see his parrot flapping violently against its cage. "I see you haven't changed either," she muttered, remembering just how many times that damn bird had woken her up in the middle of the night. All day those memories had been flooding back to her. The hours that had passed sat on the couch had felt like days, lost in the never-ending swirl of memory after memory. The day she had arrived, her first Christmas, her first time celebrating her birthday, just how happy Fiona and Eden had been when she got accepted to college. At first, she had wondered why she was only remembering the happy memories, but after a few hours had come to the realization that it was because that was pretty much all she had from those days. For one brief, shining moment in her life, she'd been happy. And yet there she was again, exactly where she always was, undecided on whether she was going to throw away the chance to be again. Maybe this isn't a good idea, she pondered to herself as she reached what she knew to be the edge of the path to their house by a small crack she'd made in the pavement slab when she was 18. Maybe I should just go home. Raven? Her thoughts were cut off as a familiar voice reached her ears. It was gruff and slightly hesitant, but friendly. For the first time since her meeting with Yang, she felt nerves rush through her body and cause her to shake a little, but quickly swallowed them down to look up. Sat on a small patio chair with a book in hand was Eden. Though still in rather good shape, he looked so much older than the last time she'd seen him. Deep wrinkles covered his face, and what had once been pitch black hair was slowly starting to turn gray. The previously smart attire of a suit and dress pants that he would always wear until ready to go to bed had been exchanged for a pair of jeans and polo shirt. "Is that you?" he asked as he stood up from his seat and placed his book down. She paused for a second. She didn't need to talk. If she made to walk away, she knew Eden would let her go without a word. But for some reason, the very thought felt wrong. Maybe it was the years of court-mandated therapy finally kicking in to tell her that running was wrong, or maybe it was the fact that she knew deep down that she didn't want to go. Whatever the reason, it was enough for her to finally fight against her natural instincts. "Why yeah," she muttered, taking a deep breath and looking up at the man. "It's me." It could have been the wind, but she swore she heard a breath of relief leave the man as he began to walk down the driveway towards her. Coming to a stop in front of her, their heads level, the streetlight illuminated his tired face. The once gleaming silver eyes of his had dulled, the chaotic, mischievous energy that they had once possessed no longer as present as it once was. The wrinkles she had seen from a distance were much more prominent than she thought, too. Numerous deep grooves stretched out from each eye, and jowls had begun to form on his cheeks. "So you finally decided to visit us, huh?" She gave a small, uncertain shrug. "I guess. Were you waiting for me?" "Huh?" Signaling towards the book, the aged man followed her gaze. "Oh no. At least not tonight anyway. Fiona gave me the boot cause I was interrupting her favorite show." "Oh." That certainly sounded like Fiona. "Guess she hasn't changed much then?" she mused. "Not at all." The man chuckled fondly. "Doesn't seem you have either. You always did have a habit of making us worry." She looked down at her feet, a small amount of shame pulsing through her. "I'm sorry." He didn't reply at first. Instead, Raven saw movement ahead of her before a strong hand fell onto her shoulder. Though her thick jacket blocked out any warmth that the man's body held, she could still feel it in the gesture. "You've nothing to be sorry for," he said understandingly. "Things like this take time, and you've your right to take it." "Still," she muttered, giving him a weak nod. "Sorry it took so long." "You're fine." The man smiled at her. "Now, let's get a good look at you." Putting his other hand on her O'Hare shoulder, the man pushed her back a small distance and looked her up and down. Crossing her arms and feeling a little awkwardness pass through her, she let him inspect her. After almost a minute, he pulled his arms away and gave her a knowing look. "Age hit you like a truck, huh?" Raven was stunned by the remark, but as the seconds passed she felt the first small chuckle of the night force its way from her throat as she remembered just how common such comments had once been between them. While Fiona had always been her emotional support, Eden had always been the guy that allowed her to truly show who she was. Frequent were the playful insults and little challenges, with rarely a day passing without one of them calling the other something that would make Fiona gasp and tap them disapprovingly on the shoulder. Not that it stopped them, however. "You're one to talk," she fired back, feeling a smile pull at her lips. "Are those jowls?" "Like a bulldog's," he laughed heartily. As his laughter echoed through the empty street, Raven saw the previously dull eyes light up again. It was a small thing, but something that seemed to put her mind at ease. Despite all her fears that her presence had only been tolerated due to summer, there the man was, so overjoyed by her return that the youth she had seen in him all those years ago was beginning to seep back into him. She paused as the man's laughter died down, and he raised an eyebrow. "I've missed you," she admitted. He stared at her for a few seconds, seeming a little shocked by the admission. However, before she could even begin to doubt herself, she saw him move forward and felt herself pulled into a tight embrace. Feeling the warmth envelop her, she let herself lean into it slightly. That time, there was no mistaking the small breath of relief he took as just the wind. "We've missed you too, Tea Leaf," he muttered quietly. "Now, are you coming inside for supper? Fiona will kill me if I keep you to myself for too long." Unlike it had for the last 8 months, the idea of saying no barely crossed her mind. "Supper sounds good," she whispered in response. As the man squeezed her tightly and rubbed her back, Raven let out her own sigh of relief. It had taken years, and so much had gone wrong along the way, but she'd finally reclaimed the things she'd been missing for so many years. Her daughter, her brother, her parents, they were all back in her life, and even if it meant fighting her nature, she wasn't going to let herself lose them again.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.